Good morning and welcome to Our Homes Ending the Housing Crisis. Our guest today is Conor Dougherty, who lives in Oakland, California. He's a Bay Area native and an economics and housing reporter at the New York Times. His work focuses on the West Coast, real estate, and wage stagnation among US workers. And his new book is Golden Gates: Fighting for Housing in America, which was named one of Time Magazine's must-read books of 2020 and a New York Times Book Review editor's choice. Conor, thank you so much for joining us on Our Homes Ending the Housing Crisis. Your book chronicles the rise of California's YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement, which is a pro-housing development movement. Over many years, we see lawsuits, we see organizing, we see the rise of politicians like State Senator Scott Wiener and Assemblymember David Chu. Conor, do you believe that the YIMBY movement has increased the number of housing units being built in California?
Uh, Thank you. Let me start by saying thank you for having me, Stanley. Senator Chang. You're so informal and you have your hat on now that I let my I dropped it. Anyway, thanks for having me here. Uh, have they increased the number of housing units? That's a hard thing to answer. But the short answer is yes. They're through things like suing the suburbs and whatever, you can point to discreetly a couple hundred units here or there that you could say this movement was directly responsible for. But I think the bigger thing, the more important thing, because as we all know, any one year of housing production, any one building, any one home, house project, whatever, is not going to change this crisis in America. What we need to do is think of housing differently, and to think of housing security differently. And in that sense, I would say that the conversation in California has changed pretty radically. And I would say that the YIMBY movement um, played a pretty large part in that by galvanizing younger professionals and really making housing a thing that a lot of people care about in local politics. Whether they're the biggest CEOs of these large tech corporations, or just kind of average, kind of yuppie workers, they've all become very activated around this issue that housing is the thing they vote on. Housing is the thing that's important to them. And obviously, the book chronicles there's a whole lot of friction with other housing groups, often those representing lower income and tenant groups. But nevertheless, the housing conversation in California has really started to bring the fact that there's a housing shortage into the conversation. And that just was absent 4 or 5 years ago, or let's say 5 to 6 years ago. And outside of people like developers. And I think that change in the narrative and the way you see, whether it's anybody from Gavin Newsom to now the even the presidential candidates, the Democratic presidential candidates, I think that piece that we have a housing shortage has really become part of the narrative statewide and even nationally. And I think as people go and craft new legislation and try to address this housing problem in the future, having this supply piece of it in mind and having it even be central to the conversation is a huge change. And I would say that the activism accounts for a lot of that.
So you chronicle a lot of the activists on the pro-housing side who are advocating for ideas like allowing greater density on existing single-family neighborhoods near transit stations. But as we know, they've met with limited success in California's legislative process. They've crashed against the hard reality of what they would call the NIMBY movement, or the Not in My Backyard movement. And your book doesn't expressly follow any of the NIMBY activists, But can you tell us about these forces, these movements that have successfully blocked the rise of the YIMBY movement and prevented a dramatic growth in the housing supply in Hawaii? I mean, in California?
So there's one major chapter that was there was the excerpt in the New York Times, which your native son Barack Obama actually tweeted, which was kind of amazing. Um, uh, about there's a developer who wants to build an affordable or a market rate, but with some affordable component, apartment complex in a suburb called Lafayette. And there's this whole long saga involving a bunch of lawsuits involving a group that wants to prevent this apartment complex and then subsequently becomes a single family home development. They are NIMBYs. So, I mean, they are what people would call NIMBYs. I don't think they would call themselves that. So you do, see these people in court, you see how they organize an election, I don't know that any of the characters were as memorable as the YIMBY activists, but I mean, certainly there are plenty of characters in there. You see this one woman writes this, 30-page letter detailing every different kind of thing, all their letters, all that. So there is a long chapter that gets into how they fight them on this one project. But I agree that some of the characters don't come across as memorably as some of the YIMBY characters. I mean, partly that just because, they don't drive glittery orange cars like Sonia did. But anyway, I think that their perspective frequently is, and I've spent a lot of time talking to people who are unhappy, is that their neighborhood, that they bought into their neighborhood with a certain expectation, and that this expectation and that they believe that they should have a very strong voice in either it not changing or having a very, very small unit of government um, responsible for it. So in the case of Lafayette, it's a city of 25,000 people, and the residents call it, quote, semi-rural and all that. But in reality, the city is in the middle of the Bay Area. It's in the inner Bay Area. It's, maybe 4 miles or something from Oakland. And it has a major highway and a commuter rail stop in the middle of the city. So that doesn't look like, I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time in rural America. There aren't many commuter rail lines going through the towns there. So anyway, so I think that the NIMBY perspective is pretty reasonable. It's, shouldn't my community have say over how it develops? But I think the larger question is, what are we drawing those borders too small? If we're talking about a larger region, a metropolitan region with tons of jobs and tons of people kind of congregating there for, in the case of the Bay Area, I mean, multiple corporations worth more than $1 trillion. Is a little city of 25,000 people, like, is it really a city of 25,000 people? Or is it just like a neighborhood inside of this larger megalopolis, right? And I think that that's kind of the tension, which is, what body of government should be talking about, should be setting these guidelines? And this is really this eternal argument, right? Because even in California, we've had all these arguments over statewide laws for housing. You, a state senator, have inserted yourself into this debate, and typically that's not the case. Usually these are decisions made other than broad brush, made at a local level. And I think the fact that we're talking about these things going to the state, I think the fact that every Democratic presidential candidate had a zoning component of their housing plan, basically unheard of, suggests that whatever we're doing at the local level is not working. Now, it might be working in all sorts of instances in individual cities, but on net, this kind of having our housing policy set by 1 million city councils is not working.
I definitely agree that at smaller levels of decision making, there does tend to be more resistance to housing growth. But if we think about a place like the Bay Area, even the big cities like San Francisco are not particularly pro growth. Um, and if we think about Hawaii, the 4 counties of Hawaii, none of them are particularly pro growth, Oahu being the most pro growth. And so if we aggregate all of these, you know, growth skeptic cities and counties, we're still going to end up with a growth skeptical larger region, which makes it challenging and which kind of begs the bigger question. You're an economics reporter, and obviously high regulatory environments for land use in places like the Bay Area in Hawaii have made it very difficult to build housing and therefore very expensive to buy housing. On the other hand, there are jurisdictions like Houston, like Atlanta, that make it easy to build housing and make it inexpensive to buy housing. So if we're, residents of Lafayette, California, or Kailua, Oahu, um, why shouldn't those who need housing seek greener pastures in the communities that are willing to expand and are willing to host them?
So this question comes up a lot. I get 2 versions of this question. One version of it is the one you just asked. And then the other version is, why can't Facebook, expand in Youngstown, Ohio? I've literally had that asked to me, but basically there are regions of the country that are very depressed and need jobs. Why can't, so there's all sorts of like economic reasons for why that appears to be unattractive to a company like a tech company. They do seem to be attracted to places that have a high level of education and high quality of life. Hence why when you see these tech companies expand, they expand to places that are just like the Bay Area. So Google, Facebook, and Apple have all said they're expanding more outside the Bay Area now than they are in it. But where are they building new things? Facebook's biggest market for employees outside of the Bay Area is Seattle. Google's colonized like half of New York, and Apple's building a $1 billion campus in Austin. So there's something about these kinds of places, whether that you again, the something usually being the presence of a large research institution and a very educated workforce, right, that attracts these kinds of higher end jobs. I think, as for what you're saying about shouldn't people or move to places like Arizona, well, that's already happening. That's already happening right now. Hundreds of thousands of people leave California each year. Same is true of Hawaii. I know that Hawaii loses more residents to domestic outmigration than California, or as a percentage of the population. But obviously California is the largest in terms of numbers. But anyway, those places, and so that's already happening. I don't know that should be our goal, that middle-class people have such a hard time in California that they leave. Is that when your teachers are leaving, is that a sign of a prosperous place? Is that a sign of a place that's doing well? I'm not sure I agree with that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, go to Boise, where they have a huge fight right now over too many Californians, or that's what they're saying, but moving there. Go to Boulder, Colorado, where you hear Google, where the arguments over Google and their buses are just as loud as they are in the Bay Area. So I think that we should, people moving in and out of places is a piece of America. I mean, in San Francisco, tens of thousands of people move in and out every year. That's normal, especially for younger people who are, moving around a lot in their careers. But I guess the reason I don't like that argument is that it's fundamentally an argument that says people who want to be teachers, people who want to be any kind of middle-class profession should not be in this place. I mean, that's what that amounts to. If you look at the income levels of the people who are leaving California, they typically are middle income. They're usually not poor, and they're usually not uber rich. They are people who make $75,000 or $80,000 a year, and can make it, but aren't satisfied with how they make it here. And I guess when you say something like that, oh, shouldn't these people just leave? It sounds like this very reasonable thing. Well, we're all full up, really sorry, right? But when you really peel behind the data, what they're effectively saying is teachers shouldn't live here. Healthcare workers shouldn't live here. And I just don't see how you can have a society when that's your posture. And also, here's the one other thing that I really have to emphasize. This is a little bit of a trick, but it's a trick on purpose. These places are adding jobs. They are affirmatively building office building after office building. They are very, take a place like Palo Alto, which is, kind of a center of the Silicon, or here's a good example. Cupertino, California is where Apple is. And there a couple of years ago, or several years ago now, they had a meeting for the Apple spaceship, Apple's large new campus, which many people may have seen in pictures. It looks like a donut, but it's commonly referred to as the spaceship. But and when they had that meeting, I don't know if you started a local government, Senator, but I'm sure you're familiar with the planning meeting. So Steve Jobs himself comes down and gives his pitch for the building. And the city council asks every right question. How are we going to accommodate all these new jobs? How are we going to have affordable housing for all this? They ask all the right questions and then approve the thing anyway, and then never build any housing. And as a matter of fact, somebody's trying to build a housing development about less than a mile from Apple's headquarters, and the city and people are suing over it and all of that. So here you have a town of, I think, about 50, 60,000 people, but in the middle of the Bay Area, right? And they are affirmatively voting through the same city local process that they lionize all the time to build what amounts to a skyscraper in the middle of town, tens of thousands of jobs there every day, for the largest, most for the most valuable corporation in like the history of human existence. And they won't build any housing for it. And I guess what I see is like, it feels fundamentally dishonest to sort of say, yes, let's build this giant job center in the middle of our town, and then say, but we shouldn't have to build any of the housing. They should all go to Phoenix. That just strikes me as not a really a serious argument, and honestly, just a very like disingenuous way of approaching it. If they were putting all sorts of limits on jobs and they were saying we really are having trouble with growth, and Apple, they were going to fight with Apple and putting a head tax on them or something like that, that they would at least then be exhibiting the behavior we would expect from someone who really wanted economic activity to go to Arizona, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is that I understand these arguments on paper, but when you look at what people really do, they're not doing that. They're just sort of pushing people out who can't afford it. Anyway.
Speaking of pushing people out who can't afford it, the climax emotionally of your book is at this YIMBY town conference, where there's a simultaneous rent control meeting going on at the same time. And it really illustrates this tension here, because let's say the YIMBYs get their way, and let's say these single family neighborhoods near job centers like the Apple headquarters, or near transit centers like the Lafayette rail station, commuter rail station, are built. What we do know is, in the short term, a lot of lower income people will see their houses demolished and replaced with much higher density new construction units, which will be more expensive than whatever's there currently in terms of the rent. And at least in the short term, there will be an imbalance where a neighborhood that was previously low rent will become a high rent neighborhood. And that's one of the main divisions that you highlight in your book, though the division between the pro-growth forces who do want existing neighborhoods to be redeveloped, and pro-tenant forces who don't want existing neighborhoods to be redeveloped. How do you think that tension will be reconciled, or will it be reconciled at all?
So let me just say two things and take some issue with the way you phrased the question. I ultimately, places have to decide how they want to develop, right? And that is up to their democracy. And I see YIMBYs and NIMBYs. I know we're getting a little neon in how we're describing them. A lot of people exist along the majority of people exist along a spectrum, right? I saw the YIMBY movement as an interesting generational, because if you look at them, the NIMBYs are by and large older and the YIMBYs are by and large younger, right? I mean, if you just go to the different meetings, it's clear, right? I saw it as a generational counterbalance. And I thought that was trying to insert something new into a conversation that in California, at least, has been, NIMBYism is just sort of like the air we breathe. It's not even controversial. It's not even something people argue over because it's so predominantly the way, right? So but nevertheless, when you go to any given city, they're who the quote unquote YIMBYs are is, it tends to be a little different from place to place. And so anyway, my point is when you say YIMBYs get their way, you're talking about people who just show up to meetings in their individual place. And, okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, in California, at least, it is, or particularly in the Bay Area, it is functionally impossible to destroy affordable housing unless it is, or rent-controlled housing, unless it is, falling apart, basically, right? So I don't think anybody's talking about demolishing existing housing and particularly affordable housing, and replacing it with luxury housing. As a matter of fact, the main fight in San Francisco has been about, can you increase density, possibly destroying some commercial buildings, but even then they'd usually be built back with a commercial component, in lower density neighborhoods, which in the Bay Area and presumably certainly in most of America accounts for like 3/4 of the land mass of the city. So that, I guess what I'm saying is like, nobody's really talking about going and demolishing all the affordable buildings and replacing them with luxury buildings on the belief that that would solve the problem. I know that that's a caricature some people paint, but I've never heard anyone seriously mount that argument. Maybe some libertarian person out there would say that, but anyway. So I guess, so I guess what I'm saying is that there are places to build things, and there are places to redevelop. There's all sorts of public land. The project in Lafayette that I'm talking about is a parcel of commercial land that has been zoned for multifamily development for 50 years. So it's not, there's nothing there, right? So I think that there's a lot we can do with the land we already have. And I think there's all sorts of redevelopment that can happen of commercial buildings or other things. And I ultimately think that, and I'm not, I also want to just say, and I think the book makes this clear, I'm not saying supply is everything. I mean, there's a whole saga in the book about, a 15-year-old girl fighting for, to not be evicted and eventually starting a renters' rights movement. There's another whole chapter about a nun who buys an existing affordable apartment building to deed restrict it as affordable forever. I think that those pieces, those are absolutely fundamental pieces of how we can help solve this crisis, because you're creating stability for those tenants and allowing them to have more stable lives. You are going to be allowing them to focus on work and education and all these sorts of things that you can focus on when you're not worried about having a roof over your head. But I don't think the housing crisis in California is fundamentally a housing crisis of, uh, you know, the problem is that things that should be cheap are expensive. There's a lot of really dingy apartments in California that are not charged dingy prices because there aren't enough of them. And I think that supply piece of it is not the only piece, but I think it's a big piece. And it's the piece that we have the most control over. A lot of people want to just do nothing but focus on the inadequacies of the federal government. And absolutely, we should focus on that. I mean, community development block grants, which is kind of one of the main sources of affordable housing funds for cities, is, on an inflation adjusted basis, is like fallen by about 80% over the past 40 years. So absolutely, that's a problem. But I do think the supply side of it is something that a place like, California or San Francisco can have an effect on. And, as going to work every day, there are the things you can control and there are the things you can't control. And, that is one of the ones they control. So I guess, I guess, anyway, my answer to your question is, I do not think anybody should be tearing down affordable apartment complexes to build luxury apartment complexes. In the Bay Area, that's basically illegal. The more common thing you see is a lack of supply prompting investors to go buy affordable buildings, evict everyone, and raise their rent. Now, that's something obviously we should try to regulate and make more difficult. But ask yourself, why is the investor buying an existing building and jacking up the rent? The answer is, because it's profitable for them to do so. So, um, you know, I think that supply imbalance has created all sorts of business models that are pretty nasty. Now we can try to regulate those business models out of existence, and I think obviously if tenant protections and all that sort of thing are a good thing. But we should also remember that we're inviting those business models into our community when we make it so profitable for them to do that. So.
So let's imagine a world where we do get a large amount of new affordable supply on land that was not, previously occupied by low-income tenants and, what have you. So, in Hawaii, for instance, we have proposals such as our Aloha Homes proposal to put, 100 towers at the Aloha Stadium site, is one idea. Now, we've also seen empirically a large number of civil disobedience movements against unpopular development projects here, notably the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea, Sherwood's Beach Park improvements in Waimanalo, Kahuku wind turbines, even an affordable housing project proposed in Kailua where there were, caravans and rallies and so on. So even if the legislature passes all the great bills in the world, all the pro-growth, pro-density bills in the world, when people are laying themselves across roadways and engaging in civil disobedience, what should the state do? What should the government do?
Well, not to get too philosophical for a moment, but people, there's always going to be resistance to new things, right? And I think as a and it's your job and other people's job as a legislatures and public servants and people who ultimately decide whether or not these things get greenlit, to try to listen to their community and figure out, and not just listen to who shows up, but really go around and try to figure out, is this going to benefit people, right? Is this going to be net a good thing? I think that, and recognizing that there's not going to be the perfect thing. That's not an easy job. I guess it's called public service for a reason. And I understand and empathize, even if it doesn't always seem it when I'm writing, that's a hard job to sign up for. I think that we might be better off if we had less discretion. Of course, I know that would go off the rails in all sorts of other ways, right? But when every single project has the opportunity to be politicized to the max, I think you're going to end up with more politicization, right? So we have a framework in California right now that Scott Wiener, who I know was on this program, helped create, a law called SB 35. And I'm not here to say that SB 35 is the greatest law in the world or whatever, but I do think that the framework behind it is fundamentally sound thinking. And the framework is this: the state passes all these rules that basically say how communities have to develop based on their job growth. So based on, kind of like I was saying in Cupertino, how much they have invited jobs to their region, because if you're going to get all those jobs, you have some responsibility for housing too. And the state passes those laws or sends out those, what are these numbers? I could get into all the acronyms, but I'm going to spare you. And so, but they can do whatever they want. You can say where they want to put them, what size they have to be. They have a lot of flexibility to sort of like take this plan and make their own local plan around it. What SB 35 says is basically, okay, look, great, make those plans, do those plans. But if you don't ever actually act on those plans, if you don't actually ever build this housing, we're going to take the power away from you, and we're going to make it so that the city council essentially can no longer weigh in on certain housing projects. And on top of that, it codifies some sort of things like labor, and then also of inclusionary zoning, an affordable housing component. And I think that I like that framework for two reasons. One, it gives localities a whole bunch of flexibility to create their community in the way they want to, understanding that if they're going to build jobs, they're going to have to build housing. And it also helps codify some of our social goals, like affordable housing, into a pretty large framework that then makes developers, it kind of creates like a North Star, where it's like, if you can, if you're going to build this project and you're willing to use union labor and you're willing to put in a sizable percentage of affordable housing in it, you can just have a permit, fine. You've met all those goals, you can do it. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think a higher level process where you are incorporating some of your social goals while also creating a framework for cities to design things the way they want to design them. I guess that's something that I think is a better way to do it, because then we're talking about our regions as regions and not talking about them as projects. And I just think that when we get into the specifics of every specific project, it just leads to a whole lot of time spent talking about the pitch of the roof and, all these different things that feel, I mean, frankly, for a Bay Area that considers itself so, free thinking, like a little programized, like, you know what I mean? And so I think ultimately my answer is, I think that the process should be done at a higher level. I think it should be done at a level that is recognizing that we have regions and that those regions need to function as regions.
Well, there are definitely success stories out there. And in a recent New York Times article that I read with a lot of interest, which unfortunately came out right after the election, so it was probably drowned out by all the Biden Trump news, was about development in the Phoenix, Arizona area called the cul-de-sac Tempe, which is a car-free development in one of the most car-dependent metro areas in the country, if not the world. How did this development come to be? And do you think it's a model that can be replicated everywhere?
Yeah. So I wrote that article, as you know. And on top of that, and it did do okay. Traffic was not gangbusters, but it did surprisingly well, given what was going on that weekend. I don't know if it can be replicated, but here's what I thought was interesting. One of the things I've learned when you write about a startup is that you can't get there's always a chance that a startup will fail, and you just have to accept that that's part of the deal. But what's interesting about startups isn't so much whether or not they succeed or fail. What's interesting is the underlying idea that makes them think they will succeed is usually an interesting idea, is usually something important. For instance, there was a million different companies that were trying to do what Google was doing. And the interesting thing about all of them was that they recognized that the internet would become this repository of information and that figuring out how to search it would be an important thing. Turned out that was an important thing. When I look at cul-de-sac and I ask, what problem are they trying to solve? Not the problem they are trying to solve is that there is a huge demand for kind of more walkable, pleasant urban neighborhoods that are of moderate density, not 50-story skyscrapers, which honestly I don't like that much. Somebody once referred to them as vertical sprawl, and I basically agree with that. 3 and 4 story, 5, 6-story buildings are I mean, not to be too opinionated here, but I find that much more pleasant. I think Paris is more fun than Manhattan, but Paris is not low density by any means, right? So they recognize that there's this huge demand for this type of product, but that there basically isn't that much of that product, and no one's really building it. Whether you're in the Mission District of San Francisco or the West Village of New York, or whatever your historic neighborhood that's very cute and fun in Honolulu is, these neighborhoods are neighborhoods that were already built. And so I think that we definitely know that there is demand for what they're trying to build. And we definitely know that there is not enough supply being built. So I think some version of what they're doing, whether or not it's literally car free or just car light, has a huge chance of success if they can figure out how how to incorporate it with the broader city. Because there are like, master plan communities that are pretty walkable, but they're all in the middle of nowhere. Seaside in Florida is kind of the famous one. So I think figuring out how to build neighborhoods like what they're building, and figuring out how to do it in the context of an already urbanized environment that you can plug into, I think that has a lot of promise, and I think they're thinking about it the right way. Whether or not they can execute is, I don't really feel like it's my job to predict that. I just think that there is a problem that they have identified, and it's a pretty universal problem.
Can you paint the picture of life in this cul-de-sac development? A lot of folks in Hawaii would find it difficult to imagine a world where they don't have a car. They need to send their kids to school. They need to go grocery shopping at Costco. How do these people actually live?
So I will say, as somebody who did not have a car until I had 2 kids, it's very difficult. I think it would be very difficult to live in cul-de-sac and have kids in school, period. And all the people I interviewed who were on the waiting list to move there were exactly who you see living in these kind of like more walkable urban neighborhoods. They were empty nesters and young professionals, right? So it's not to say that I don't, as the owner of a single family home who has a SUV with 2 car seats in the back and has to drive to the grocery store all the time. Uh, Although I don't take the kids anymore because of coronavirus. I'm not every single, there's people are at different points in their life cycle, and there should be different types of housing for them at that life cycle. And I think that's like fine, right? So the people who live there, so that's just to say the people who live there generally don't have kids. It's not open yet, but I talked to the people who were moving in. I think that they will be people who will, probably a lot of them will work in the Tempe area. So they'll either be university people or some of the companies around there. Zoom, what we are using right now, is about to open an engineering office in the Tempe area. So it could be people like that. I suspect they will be people who either take bike share, transit, their own bike, transit, or one of these scooters or something, or an Uber after COVID, to work or to wherever they want to go. If they want to go out and get a drink or whatever, I think they would use Ubers. But I think that they're people who, if they have, if they want to go away for a weekend, or they want to go visit a friend on the other side of town, will use something like Zipcar. I don't think it's literally Zipcar, but a car sharing type thing. I lived in San Francisco for several years under a similar arrangement. I took BART to work, but I did go away on weekends and stuff, and would always take a car. It was more expensive than renting a car. I'm sorry, it was more expensive than like going to like Hertz, but the car was in my neighborhood. I could, and I didn't own a car. So I think that if you do not have to deal with this juggling of the car seats, and you don't have a hobby, this might be a non-starter in Hawaii, like surfing, where you have, your car becomes a very active part of your life. I think it can work. That's not everybody, but it's still a pretty sizable number of people.
So we have a question, Connor, from your
Yes.
former Wall Street Journal colleague, Sarah Lynn.
My dear friend, Sarah Lynn, who I worked next to for many years. Do you think NIMBYism is generational versus classist, and how does that change the strategy to win those people over? Okay. I don't actually know the answer to this. Obviously it's caught up in a lot of things, right? Like a lot of it is generational. And by generational, I just mean that people don't want things to change. I don't think that they are like, I don't want any young people living in our neighborhood. In fact, Marin County, one of the most NIMBY places in the Bay Area, you do hear people complain that it's basically become a retirement community and that they would like that to change. But there's no real avenue for that to change. So I'm sure they would love to see it change generationally. It's just so in that sense, I think it's just, the generational, they don't want anything to change around them. I think it's classist. Yeah, I think it's classist in that you certainly hear people say they don't want apartments near them. Um, and I also think there's a lot of people who just don't like uh there's a lot of problems in the Bay Area, homelessness and that sort of thing. And I think it creates a mentality amongst some people that they just want their neighborhood to not, they're aware that their neighborhood could become the site of a homeless encampment, and they just sort of, it puts them into a defensive posture, even if it's not necessarily logical. So, and I also think that people are, I mean, people claim that this is not true, but I think people are very defensive of their home values, particularly here. A lot of people, it's kind of this vicious cycle where people spend a lot of money, home prices increase, and then people who buy homes have to stretch really far to buy them. And then that creates this kind of feedback loop where they then um, are very defensive because they just put everything they have into the home. So I think there's a lot of different reasons for it. Um, and, and I think also, look, sometimes it doesn't work. There is traffic, there is, right? These things exist, right? I will say one inspiring thing though, this is going to sound very Pollyannish. Maybe I should say this at the end, but I'll say it now anyway. One of the more inspiring conversation I had with Sonia Traus, who is, this kind of caustic leader of the YIMBYs in my book. One of the one few times I heard her say something, starry-eyed and optimistic, was she was saying, think of all these people in Lafayette. When she was feuding with them, she was like, now these are people who are very educated people, but a number of them are lawyers. One of them is a nuclear engineer. They have tremendous resources. I mean, they self-financed a pretty significant lawsuit. On top of that, they appear to have truly astounding amounts of time. These are really busy people with, kids and jobs and all these things. And they are there at like every late night city council meeting. They are there organizing. They got all these living room meetings. I mean, these are, in total, amongst all the groups, I mean, these are thousands and thousands of what amount to volunteer hours off a pretty small population of really educated people. I find it hard to believe that with that kind of energy, you couldn't solve every problem that there were, pretty much every problem in the world, honestly, but every problem that they are worried about happening. They're worried about this, they're worried about that. They're worried about, is there going to be enough money for the schools? Is there going to be, I mean, every single thing they're worried about, their posture is to say to just stop it. But if you could just somehow redirect that energy, I mean, again, thousands of what volunteer hours, all these donations, all these things just to stop this one building that might have 300 people in it. And it just feels like it's just such a waste of energy in a negative way when if you took that same energy and put it in a more positive way, I just don't see how those problems couldn't be solved.
Speaking of solving problems, one thing that I've personally observed is that in the jurisdictions that do manage to provide abundant, affordable housing for everybody, like Singapore, like Vienna, those started during huge national crises whether it's, World War I leveling the city of Vienna, whether it's Singapore being kicked out of Malaysia in 1963. Um, these crises catalyzed massive housing construction programs. You mentioned Paris earlier, and of course, the same thing happened in Paris, where there was a huge housing construction program um, under Napoleon III that demolished the medieval city and replaced it with what we know today. We're currently going through the largest economic dislocation in at least a century in the United States with the pandemic. I don't personally get the sense that this pandemic has catalyzed any fundamental way of thinking about housing. However, what we're still talking about is issues that are important, like moratoriums on evictions for non-payment of rent, but which will fundamentally not alter the housing system that we have as a country. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be true? And if it's not true, that what the pandemic might catalyze in terms of replacing our broken housing system today?
Um, it's hard for me to say, um, it's hard for me to say what I think will happen specifically with the pandemic. The reason being that if we get a vaccine and things go back to relatively normal, we will appropriately be very focused on the employment side of things. Um, I do think, so there's that. This housing crisis is like 40 years old at this point. And it's become a huge problem, one that's, I hesitate to say bigger than the pandemic, but one that's longer and more aching. And I think that, and I can tell you, it is reaching more and more places. Obviously Minneapolis is a place that's been ahead on the housing front. Smaller places like Nashville, um, you know, Charlotte just had a big fight over a potentially car-free development, because they're trying to build it more affordably there, and if they can get rid of the cars, they can do that. So I think that um, there is, I think that we are due for some kind of like national housing and transit discussion, because our cities aren't working. And I don't think we're going to work from home our way past that problem, contrary to what some people think. So, and everyone talks about infrastructure and wanting infrastructure. And so I do think there is an opportunity for a grand bargain of some kind. I suspect that bargain will be some kind of trade-off between environmental concerns and funding. In California, for instance, we've now spent $100 billion on a train from Bakersfield to Merced, two towns that a lot of people in this call probably have never even heard of. It was supposed to, they're in the middle, right? And it was supposed to go from LA to San Francisco. I mean, that's crazy. $100 billion for that, I think that there's a potential for a building program in America, whether or not it's in response to the pandemic. But I do think that it's one that has to recognize that the cost of how we are building right now is basically unacceptable. And we're going to have to figure a way through that. One thing I'll also add is that I also just think there really is a generational component here. If you go read about post-World War II America, it was like the country was basically rebuilt entirely for this baby boom generation. We never did anything like that. We have not done anything like that for the millennial generation, which is now larger than the baby boom, largest generation in American history. I mean, just look at what this country did to try to accommodate this huge growth of people. I'm technically a Gen Xer, so I'm a young Gen Xer, but and we never did that for, and one of the things about millennials, it's not that they're special in any particular way, even though there's been too many articles written about that. It's that there's simply quite a lot of them. And we've never attempted to recognize that. And I think that at some point I think that is, to answer Sarah's question again, why there's a huge generational component, because they sort of know they're being screwed. And I think that when you look at these YIMBY movements and all these different people, there is a real pro-housing consensus, I think, starting to emerge. In San Francisco, there's all these fights over whether or not it should, the kind of more socialist leaning people want public housing, and the YIMBY leaning people want a mix of affordable housing and market rate housing. But fundamentally, they're all talking about how do you start a building program. And so I do think the conversation has moved towards a more affirmative amongst the people in this generation. And as they get older and their housing needs grow, it's just going to get worse. So I think that though this problem has defied gravity for so long that I've come to at times believe gravity doesn't exist, I still think eventually the gravity will exist.
We have another question from the audience. So you mentioned the tremendous energy being expended to stop buildings and developments. Mm-hmm. Are there any successful models of community-based action to build more government housing, affordable housing rather, instead of the top-down government-based models that we've been discussing?
I mean, there's all sorts of nonprofits that build housing. I think there are community-based. Here's what I would say about this. I think there's a lot of really great models for community-based housing and community-based action, but I do think that you don't want it to be too community-based in the development. And here's what I mean by that. There are some affordable housing developers that do really great community-based development in California, but they spend like $900,000 per unit building it. That's just like not sustainable. So we need some model where the community has input in design and social, all those kinds of things that are important, but that the actual building of it is somewhat more off the shelf, or else we're going to have a lot of or else we're never going to really like take a bite out of the problem. I will say on the community land trust side, there's a million great models for that. And those do not need any real scale. They need money, but that's it. And they usually involve a nonprofit buying buildings and then deed restricting them. I think that's a model where the kind of, I don't want to say the smaller the better, but it's like landlording. It's better at a smaller level. So it's ethical landlording, but people get to know their tenants and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that there's all sorts of nonprofit models for advocacy, but that when it really comes to the actual building, figuring out how to do it efficiently is pretty important, because I do think the cost side of things, particularly in California, is bad. I'm optimistic about modular housing and some of these other technology models that are coming along, but we'll see. There are some other questions here. By the way, I'm happy to stick around for a little longer if you want, but I'm also happy not to, depending on I know you're, someone asked, is there a problem? Are salaries too low? Absolutely, there was a problem with salaries being too low. And not only that, I just was reading this the other day, fascinating thing, I tweeted it. We do have a huge problem with the bifurcation of the market right now. When I say bifurcation, what I mean is we have luxury buildings that are being built, and they actually have relatively high vacancy rates, and they seem to be increasing during the pandemic, at least in California. And then we have affordable housing that's usually existing, And no matter how bad things get, this seems like there's always so much demand that their vacancy rate is effectively zero. There was a similar problem in New York City around 1909, and there was a bunch of garment strikes. And the garment strikes raised wages pretty considerably for workers, and rents paradoxically went down. And the reason they think rents went down is that these two separate markets kind of became one market, meaning that renters who can only afford affordable apartments right now and are therefore paying higher rents because they're all crowding into one market could then start to access some of those higher end units, and where the vacancy rate is high, and so it kind of like evened it out a little bit. I'm not sure that can happen here, but my point is that raising salaries for people is a huge, I think should be a huge piece of this, but I don't know. I don't, other than minimum wage, in California, we have $15. Um, I don't know a lot of really great way to do that. But I will say, I think this is an important thing to remember. I don't know how helpful this is, but it's certainly important to remember. Around the country and around the world, we've really created this kind of bifurcated economy where you have higher end workers who typically are in some kind of quote unquote knowledge job, tech and finance being the two kind of symbols of that. And then you have a lot of lower wage workers in areas like service, restaurants, retail, cleaning homes, personal services, dog walking, um, and what's and these sort of hollowing of the middle class is the kind of loss of these value add industrial jobs that used to pay a very decent wage to people with less education. What's Not only has that happened, these two groups of people, these service workers and these knowledge workers, essentially have to live next to each other. The service sector is defined as basically being around the kind of higher value industry. And so, and really service jobs are basically jobs that can't be automated and can't be outsourced. And so people like Senator Chang and other public officials are local, state and local officials are sort of charged with, here's this massive global force that took decades and decades to create, and then it just sort of manifests in an impossible housing market because it's like one housing market that's trying to accommodate this very stratified economy. Um, and so figuring out how, so really at some level, you are trying to figure out how to make the lower paid worker be more, to earn more so that we have a healthier middle class. But you're also trying to figure out how to make the housing market reflect this huge amount of income inequality in cities. And that's like a hard thing. I mean, to some extent, this has always been our challenge. I mean, you go read, as you were talking, you're obviously a student of urban history. This problem has been around for quite some time. It probably never go away, but this is kind of always our challenge. And so I do think that the wage piece of it does have to be a piece of it. It's hard to make that part of the, like a housing bill. You know what I mean? You either are addressing housing or you're addressing salaries, but it is definitely a piece of it is all certainly one piece of this whole thing. So legal vacation rentals, I don't, Senator, that's your area, but it's a, it's a very thorny area. So,
Yeah, well, let me try to, address this issue of, I'm a supply guy,
mhm.
right? And at the end of the day, I think there's a strong psychological impulse to try to resist everything but supply, but I don't think that that's intellectually honest. The city and county of Honolulu just did a major crackdown on vacation rentals in 2019, so about a year ago. And it wasn't 100% effective, but it was pretty effective. Just yesterday, Airbnb and Expedia announced that they were going to start cooperating with the city of Honolulu to further enforce vacation rental laws, which should further reduce the number of illegal vacation rentals out there. Yet since 2019, rents have not gone down in Honolulu. Median home prices have hit record highs, $880,000 in September, in the bottom of the pandemic. And I think that these are just, while they help, I think that they're just scapegoats. And what I try to remind people is that 18,000 new babies are born a year here in Hawaii. So these are obviously local people. They're not these dreaded Californians migrating in. We have 10,000 people who die every year, which means that we have 8,000 new local people every year. We build on average about 2,000 new units of housing per year. So frankly, it doesn't matter if all 8,000 of those new local people are tech startup billionaires. The housing simply does not exist to accommodate them. And, that's one of the reasons why I'm so focused on supply and large scale supply in particular. You can shoot every one of the vacation rental owners in Hawaii. You can free up all of the available homes in Hawaii for local families that exist today. But unless we start building more, local people will have to leave. And, I think that's the only intellectually honest way to look at the problem. So I don't know if you have a way of approaching it.
No, I think that's well said. You are somebody who has to think about solutions and think about them in a what's going to move the needle. And I am someone who has the freedom, different job, to kind of dilly-dally a little bit and sort of think about the problem in a lot of different ways. And that's okay. I mean, they're different jobs, right? But I agree with you that one of the things I say to people is that one of the difficulties of been talking about housing is that everyone at least has enough of a point, right? Like there are, for instance, there are, it's true that a number of Airbnbs in San Francisco have taken rental stock off the market. That's absolutely true. Is that the reason that rents are going up? I mean, of course, it doesn't help, but what is that compared to 40 years? I mean, as I say in my book, the first big book written on this problem in the Bay Area was in 1979, and essentially nothing has happened since then. So, the founders of Airbnb were not born yet. So I agree with what you're saying, is that because I am in this, I joked dilly-dally, but because I'm able to kind of think about this problem in a lot of different ways, I sometimes I'm not always cognizant of the political scapegoats as well as the sort of magnitude of these things. So it was kind of funny. I was saying to someone the other day this thing about wages that I just kind of told you about in New York. And all these people started attacking me on Twitter. People who usually are like, oh, I read your book, I loved your book, whatever. And the reason they were attacking me was that they thought I was like giving fuel to some anti-housing argument. And of course, in my mind, I'm like, look, I just read this interesting thing about worker power and wages. I think it's kind of fascinating how these markets shifted as wages went up. I'm just like sharing this like kind of neat little thing that I thought. And it made me realize how difficult this conversation is, because as you just said, people want to believe that there is just some solution that doesn't involve new building. And it's hard. And of course, one of the other things, as I was trying to tell people, I was like, in 1909, New York was building like, tens of thousands of units a year. So I was like, it wasn't about building, it was about just this interesting thing about how income can be part of this. And absolutely, it is true that the loss of the middle class has played, I don't know if it's playing a role in the housing problem, but it's certainly a big piece of our economic problems in America, right? So anyway, this is just to say I agree with what you're saying, and I understand that in your job you have to focus to a degree that I basically don't. But and that a lot of times in the political sphere, people don't want to leave a lot of room for nuance because it can be confusing to people. But I do think it's a multifaceted problem, but this is kind of what I was alluding to before. It's a multifaceted problem, but if you're a local person and you want to try to make it better in your locality, like building's the one thing you can, not only that you can do, you can control it to a degree that you just can't. I'm sure that you wish that your cities had much more money in community development block grants. Let's assume that's the case. But other than, dutifully writing your representatives or in Congress or talking to them, which I'm sure you have the occasion to do, you don't really have any power over that. Whereas this building thing you do. And so, yeah, anyway, that's all a very long way of saying I agree with what you're saying, but I also, I try to listen to people, and try to find a lot of different stories in this area, whether or not they relate to the overall magnitude of the problem. So
Great. Well, Conor, we really appreciate your hard work on housing related issues. Your new book is Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America, and it's available everywhere now. Thank you again for sharing your insights with our audience today.
thank you for having me, and happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Please be safe. Um, we are at a very, very dangerous moment. So please be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.